This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. This is going to be a great conversation with Dr. Timothy Eaton. He has a doctorate in education, and he and his wife have been homeschooling for 15 plus years. How long is it now, Tim?
Well, one thing I always say is birth to university now that we've done it for so long, but my oldest daughter is 21. And so I'd say, 17 plus years technically, but I think we've been doing that from the very beginning. We just didn't know it.
Yes, that's a good point. Well, he is in Alberta, Canada, and he's creator of this Golden Hour podcast. And I'm going to be honored to be interviewed on his show pretty soon. So you can also hear us conversing there. But welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be with you.
Well, it's a little bit unusual to have a dad who's outspoken on the subject of homeschooling. And why was that important to you to homeschool and to get involved as a father?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm sure we're going to get to it, but I talk about a course that I created called the Proactive Homeschool Dad, PhD. And when I started off, I was really typical in the sense, and I feel safe saying that because I've talked to enough homeschool dads that I know that that's accurate. And that is that the wife typically, or the mom typically, is the principal educator. I think it's 95 or 97% of principal home educators are moms. And I was typical in the sense that I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Felt kind of weird at first and for a while, and didn't really get that involved. And then as I watched things and I saw like the fruits of what was happening with my children, I just became more and more interested. And I thought, man, this is my family and this is a lifestyle we've chosen. I really should be more a part of this, like more proactive and intentional about it. And then fast forward a few years, I decided to, my wife and I decided together that I would pursue a doctorate degree at the University of Alberta and in education. And I did that in my emphasis. I wrote my dissertation on home education and specifically secondary home education. And then after that, I've just been more and more interested in observing my own kids. And most of my interest comes from my own children and my own family and the way my wife has done things. And so, yeah, fast forward that to the present. And now I'm trying to help other dads kind of skip over some of the stuff that I wasn't so good at.
Okay, I'm going to probe a little bit. What were you not so good at?
Well, COVID, for example, where people were going home with their kids, people were calling it homeschooling, and people can call it whatever they want. But philosophically, the home educating is a lifestyle that really is embedded in certain principles. And I'm a very public school product, if you will. And so I have to de-school on a regular basis, which means basically really transferring the way I think to a new way of thinking. And that takes a lot of effort. I mean, it takes intentional effort. And so, a specific example would be, and this is something that was a point of kind of argument between my wife and I when we were first starting. She was reading a lot of philosophy about home education, John Taylor Gatto, Charlotte Mason, John Holt, and so on, Dorothy and Raymond Moore and others. And I wasn't reading all that stuff. And so I didn't have this like foundation and this background. So for example, the kids would leave, my wife would leave stacks of books all over our house and like very intentionally, but at least I don't remember her, communicating what she was doing. She was just kind of experimenting on her own. And I would be like, what's up with all the books everywhere? Like, let's clean some stuff up. And, I'd be like that. And little did I know the beauty of what was happening, that my children, instead of going to, they didn't have the option of a television because we didn't have one and still don't, but they would stumble upon books. And so they read books and, they weren't playing games on a computer. They were reading and they were talking and they were conversing. And so that's one example where I was kind of a typical dad, just kind of bumbling along and saying, what's up with the messes? Little did I know there was magic happening for my kids.
Oh, that's That's beautiful. Yeah, homeschooling can be messy in at several levels.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
maybe was she leaving those books out a little bit as bait for you to
Yeah, well, I don't
find
know.
out what she was doing?
Definitely bait for them. I don't know about bait for me, but and then I did. Like, I mean, one of the central, tenets of what we do is definitely based on reading to our children and being read to. And my wife, to this day, we have, our kids range now from 11 to 21. But anytime any of the kids are home, they're being read to by my wife.
Really? Even now? Oh, that's
Oh yeah,
really cool.
yes.
What kinds of things do you all like to read to your older, even adult kids?
Yeah. So I mean, and that's such a wide array, a wide array of topics and books. But if you're familiar with Charlotte Mason, she talks a lot about avoiding twaddle, which is basically, today we might say bubblegum or stuff that doesn't edify, stuff that doesn't enrich the soul, and each can
Mhm.
be his or her own arbiter of what that means. But for us, there's so much good. I guess the principle is there's so much good out there. Why spend time with anything other than the good? And again, each family can decide what that good is. But for us, it would be definitely classical writings. We love, for example, some of my personal favorites are Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, and The Bronze Bow, and the Little Britches series. And so my wife is reading classic literature to them. She'll also, depending on their age, and our interests or what's happening in the news, she'll get something on like Cal Newport stuff on technology and how to use phones and how to use technology as a tool instead of being the tool.
Mm.
And so there's a wide array, but again, there's so much good. Why spend time on the stuff that doesn't edify?
Absolutely. Yeah. You talk elsewhere about the 6 roles of a proactive homeschooling dad. Would you be willing to tell my audience about that?
You bet. So the way that this, maybe a little context for that, is that my wife and I, before we started this Golden Hour podcast, we were talking about, how, because here's how that all came about. People are constantly asking my wife, who, she wouldn't say this, and she's not the one that wants to be in front of a camera ever. And but she had people asking her constantly about what is she doing, and like why are my kids taking this route, and why homeschool, and amongst homeschool families, especially newer ones, how is this, what are you doing to make this work out as it is? And they were just impressed with some of the things that my kids were doing. And so after family, it was like, man, we need to have something that kind of teaches these principles, not to get people from asking questions, but to give them a place to go to. So we started the podcast, and then I've developed since then a course called the Proactive Homeschool Dad, which is, I call it short, PhD. And in my own experience, and after 17 plus years of being a homeschool father, I've just noticed a lot of times places where I'm actually weaker, and so from that, I've had lots of hard knocks learning experiences, and I've kind of sifted all that down into 6 different identities and roles. And so that's where those come from. Those different roles. The different roles are: be a learner, be a companion, be a listener, be an advocate, be a participant, and be a protector. And when you go through the course, you kind of see, like, what do all those mean, and how does it break down, and what are the specific actions that actually implies for a homeschool father. And the principles apply to any homeschool parent, but because I'm a dad, I focus on dads, and I feel like I can empathize and relate more closely to fathers.
Could you expand on one of those to give us an idea of how you
Sure.
work that
Yeah,
out
like,
in
and one thing I would
practice,
say
for
with that is,
example?
yeah, no, that's a good question. I would say, like, that one thing that I make clear is that this is not something that is adding to the already full plate of fathers. And I guess the point that I make is that by getting married and having kids, you already chose those roles. And so it's not like you can get out of that. And so you might as well be intentional about what you're doing with your children. And so, which of those 6, Leah, would you want to hear more depth on? Learner, companion, listener, advocate, participant, or protector? Some of them will
Well,
seem a little bit more straightforward, and others are a little, require explanation.
Yeah, talk about being a companion. I kind
I'm
of
glad you
think I
asked
can
that one.
imagine several of those, but the companion is kind of unexpected to me.
Well, I'm glad you asked that one, because that one probably is. I would say the two that are, maybe the three that are hardest, that aren't as straightforward, is companion, advocate, and protector. But just, can I ask you, what's your knee jerk thought? What do you think I might be implying? And not just to play a guessing game, but when you think of that, the role, an
We can play
identity
a
or a
guessing
role of a
game. That's right.
father being a companion.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. I think of that word as applied to a wife more than to a husband. And I also remember my time as a homeschooler, that my husband, of course, he was out working. And of course, he wasn't, literally at my side most of the time. So, in what sense was he a companion? So, I want to explore that with you.
Yeah, no, that's good. So the example I gave earlier is probably a good example of, like, me wandering around the house in the early days and seeing these stacks of books everywhere, or like crafts all over the place, and now I get so excited about those things because I know what's happening and I know what's being instilled in my children. But back then, it was like, what are these messes for? And can you guys clean these up, and whatever? And so, if I were to come down to a little phrase, I would say being a companion is all about being on the same page with your spouse, and not just in the
Mhm.
decision to homeschool, but in all things. But obviously, my my audience and my niche is home education. But so, be a companion would have a lot to do with, having the same motivation and purpose for choosing that lifestyle of homeschooling. And I purposely say the lifestyle because, a lot of people think of it as like a form of education, and it is, but it's far more encompassing in that it really is a lifestyle. Like, most people that choose homeschooling, the common motivations are around freedom and flexibility, and choosing your own way of living and learning, and traveling, and whatever else people want to do. And so that's all centered in, what are your main motivations? And so when I say be a companion, it really takes discussion after discussion with a spouse, saying, what are we all about? And, like, why are we choosing this? And what are our main motivations? And for us, although our motivations have multiplied and increased and over the years, our main motivation still remains to spend more time as a family. And so academics is important, but it's lower on the list for us, compared to some of our priorities. And so within that realm of be a companion, one thing I do with homeschool families and couples is I help them to craft what I call a purpose document. And it's kind of like a mission statement for a company. But the idea is, like, what is the one statement that your family is all about? And then, what that helps you do as a family, and that could be not just for homeschool families, but, like I said, a business or any other family, is to say, what do we say yes to, and what do we say no to? For example, if you say, we're disciples of Jesus who want to follow him, and that's what your family is all about, then that gives you a clear, you know, foundation from which to operate. And then that really fuels. And so when things come in over the years and throughout the different stages, it gives you a clear, idea of what you accept and what you don't, and what you choose to pursue and what you don't. And so, be on the same page, be united in your purpose. And I'm not trying to act like it's Pollyannish. It's not like it's like butterflies and rainbows all the time as homeschool couples, but there's that shared vision of what you're about and what you're doing. Be a companion.
I love that. Being like-minded
Yeah.
is a beautiful thing, and it's that oneness in marriage that we hope we're going to achieve when we start out, and often not thinking about the education of our children, and yet coming together over homeschooling is a very just a wonderful factor in a marriage, and a man can be so proud when his wife is sacrificially serving their family in that way. What would you recommend, or I'm sure you're asked, what do you recommend when men are presented with this interest in their wife to homeschool, and if they've never, you know, covered that issue before, if it comes out of the blue to a husband, what next steps does he take?
So just to be clear on the question, you're saying if a spouse, if a wife comes to a husband and says, "Hey, I'm really thinking about homeschooling. What do you think about this?" Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah.
And so what's the specific question then? Like
What what
what would
should
I
a
counsel?
husband do when he thought, you've kind of decided how you're gonna divide up your roles and how you're spending your time and who's making the money, and maybe she had a job, maybe she had a part-time job, maybe, uh, you know, you don't know anything about homeschooling. What should a man do when he feels kind of blindsided by this
Yeah.
whole different direction for the family?
That's such a relevant question because, especially in the United States, like homeschooling is by far the fastest growing educational movement in the States and also in Canada. And I would say, it's probably similar in the world where it's able to happen. And so that's a very relevant question. My thought goes to, this is on the question of homeschooling, but if it was on the question of anything that is important in a family, it needs to be considered. It needs to be thought out. And so, for example, if a wife comes to a husband and says that, then he needs to really kind of work with her to consider the implications of the decision and weigh priorities. I think what it is more than anything is an opportunity for a couple to say, what are our priorities? What are we all about? Very similar to what I was just saying about the purpose statement and the purpose document. Because if it and then because it's easier to see what aligns with those priorities. And so instead of it being, because a lot of us do things that are kind of typical, like, or conventional. We'll say, well, homeschoolers are weird or this or that, the other, and we don't open our mind to something that could be a blessing to our families. And in my experience, it's so many of us dads that are presented with homeschooling from our spouses, and we're reluctant for the first while. And that's okay. It's just that I think the principle should be, what are our priorities as a family? Does this align with that? And really work that out. And then maybe I would encourage, that people like me exist that have been doing it for a long time and that come from a very similar background of a conventional way of having done school and life. And so asking people that have done this, and obviously it's catching fire because it's the fastest growing movement in education. And so I really
Mhm.
think that's key. Align with your priorities. And then, a lot of people get caught up in like the details, like, well, how do they get into university? And what about, like, what do you tell the school? And is it legal in our state? And those questions, they're so fair. And I get it, especially when you're coming from like no exposure to homeschooling. But I can just assure people that the answers are there, and they're actually way more simple than you think. And it's a beautiful way to do it. And so I would love to talk. You asking that question makes me want to talk to all the dads that are asked that, so I can be a resource.
Yeah. Do you find, some dads occasionally that actually they're the first adopters, they're the ones that bring the enthusiasm to the table?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. There's what I find is that uh it's typically in my case, it's my wife who asks more questions naturally. I'm more of an obedient soul who just doesn't ask and just does what I'm told. And there's good to that, but there's also a problem with that, in that you cheat yourself of potential opportunities. Like, we would never have taken this route had it had been left up to me. And so my wife was
Hmm.
asking very natural questions of, like, my daughter is 5 or 6 years old. Why again am I sending her to somebody else's care when I can do this? I'm capable. She was asking very natural, common sense questions. And then when the answers weren't satisfactory, she just has the audacity and the strength to make her own decisions and say why. And whereas I'm like, well, don't ask why, because that could make somebody ruffled. And I think I've changed and I've grown from that. But anyway, that's all of that to say there are many dads that are doing that as well. In fact, if anyone listens to the podcast, a really recent one was with a guy in Illinois, where I'm from, actually, and he's I didn't know him before this, but have you heard that one, the carp hunter? He does bow hunting
Yes.
with the fish. Well, he's a perfect example of that. If you listen to it, first of all, it's fascinating what he does. He takes people out on these boats and they literally bow and arrow these Asian carp that are in the Illinois River, which is so weird. But anyway, he's that person. He just naturally asks questions. And he's going, do I like what's happening in the school system? Do I think that we have to walk to the beat of what's happening? And does it align with our priorities? He just asks questions, and there's lots of fathers, and I would say that's increasing, mothers and fathers. Mothers are more commonly the ones that take it, because typically in a homeschool family, it's a situation where the mom has the primary care of the kids, and so her mind is on that more than the dad. I think it's just probably it's just pretty practical.
Right. Yeah. I think, we're seeing some trends of women actually being higher income earners in the family than the man, or being in jobs that might take them, traveling or have to be in an all-day setting that precludes homeschooling, with the husband maybe being the one who's more flexible,
Yeah.
who's around the house. And I've gotten to know a couple of dads who are homeschooling primarily. They're the primary instructor, and it's a little, it just feels different to me because I'm older, but it
Yeah.
seems to make a lot of sense for these people. And one of them brings in his mother-in-law quite a bit, and she helps with a lot of the things that are not in his background, including teaching
Yes.
the kids Japanese, because she's Japanese.
Nice.
So
Oh, that's awesome.
that kind of leads me to another question. Do you see many grandparents being involved, and how can grandparents assist?
Oh, that's such a great question. If I can just talk a little bit to your previous presentation of ideas, like I just feel like if what I like to do with any kind of question like that is to kind of get down to the principle, because the principle is really what are the family's priorities, what's their worldview, what's their beliefs, what are their values, and then align with those. And my family, I'm in no position to judge another family and the next family the next, right? And that's hard because sometimes we're definitely entrenched in certain traditions or ideas, whether it be religious or philosophical or whatever. And so I think the principle is each couple, each family needs to say be clear about your priorities and values, and then decide together whatever you think aligns with those priorities. So whether that's mom or dad, for us, I think we just naturally took a more traditional route. If I'm being honest, I think my wife really does have, she has cultivated the skills to probably be a more effective breadwinner, if I'm being honest. But I think she has chosen to really channel that to our children. And so that's our choice, right? And so to each her or his own. And so anyway, I like the principle discussion there. As far as grandparents, I love that question because we have learned a lot about how to incorporate all family members, given their willingness, they can contribute to somebody's family's children's education. So, for example, in our situation, one important principle about home education, and I think learning in general, as a parent, is when you see that your child is interested in something, make that your genuine interest. For example, if my son was into chess, get into chess. And my wife has been a perfect example of that. As soon as she sniffs out that he was into chess, books arrive for weeks, and he's signed up for competitions, and we're watching movies, and we go all in on interest. And I love that my wife has done that. And I know where that comes from. It comes from her mom. Her mom is probably the greatest example of somebody I know that does this. And chess is a good example. When she found out that my kids were interested in chess, she never really got into it before. And then she started getting into it, and she was ruthless. I mean, she'd play the kids when they were younger, and she was not holding back, no mercy. She was playing to win. And so
Yeah.
and that fuels this, like, it's modeling this like fire for learning and this motivation to excel. And she's done that. And so like right now she teaches my children Farsi, because my father-in-law is from Iran. And she learned it. She learned Persian, even though she's from California. And then she teaches my children a stocks class. And so she does that all online, and she does that with, she has 18, 19 grandkids now, and she does that with all of them.
Oh, how
And
wonderful.
it's interesting because it's weird because we had the first four children of we have six children. We had the first four of all their grandchildren. And now all of those families, my wife's three siblings and their spouses, they all homeschool. And so it's just kind of like this, exponential growth. And so grandparents can teach classes. They can, I know a girl that I interviewed up in Edmonton, her parents actually take the kids, I think, twice a week, and they do certain subject matter, and it's an amazing break for the couple. And it's a great opportunity for somebody, like, more exposure to not just the one parent teaching style. And there's a lot of benefits to grandparents. They can be highly engaged in their grandchildren's education, and children are less likely to be, complaining and negative towards their grandparents than they are to their own parents. And so that's also a good little benefit.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
You find that to be true. Yeah. I'll have to mull that over. Yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that. I love being a grandmother, and I do feel like I have things I want to impart to these kids. And at the grandparent stage of life, you feel a kind of urgency to teach that maybe even parents don't always have,
Right.
because parents are pulled in so many different directions at that stage of life. But
Well,
grandparents have
and
the
how
leisure
many,
to teach.
yes. And I was just going to say, and how often do parents say, oh, I mean, like my wife and I say this all the time, if we could go back and with what we know now, not only in parenting, but in homeschooling, and grandparents can kind of do that. They can actually
That's
kind of fulfill that wish and say, no, there are more and more second and third generation homeschool families where, people they get it. They get this way of life. And that's the thing with this misconception and preconceptions that people have about homeschooling. They're kind of dissipating. They're kind of going away, and people just see it as a very free, flexible way to live your life. And universities and careers are so open to this homeschooling choice because it's producing amazing fruit.
Yes, it is. I think that homeschooling students have made their case by now. They have actually persuaded these institutions that they're not a risk, they're a good bet.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, well said.
Well, how do you recommend that a couple get started? Let's say especially if they've had a child or two enrolled in school, how do they best make the transition out of a traditional mindset and set of expectations to this flexibility that you're talking about? I mean, it can sound a little amorphous and a little like, how do we start? Do we put a desk in the room and a chalkboard?
Yeah. Yes, I appreciate that. And I would say that one of the most common things that people do is they start by transitioning, which is the better word for what deschooling is. Deschooling really is transitioning from a conventional way of thinking to a different way of thinking. But and I think the most common way that people do this is they'll try to replicate what happens at school at home, which I often say is okay when you're starting, but really it's one of the biggest mistakes that homeschool families make, because the very reason you've chosen a different route was to get away from what goes down in the school system a lot of times. Not everybody, but typically. And so then the question is, then what do you do? And this might sound a little bold, but I am definitely confident enough to, if I and I think my confidence comes if a couple, let's say a couple near where you live in Tulsa, wanted to do this, and they were kind of playing with the idea, to connect them with somebody like me or a co-op in your area. I would have no problem telling any couple in North America, at least, US and Canada, to just do it, one, and to not worry about the details for literally the first, I mean, I'd be fine to say the first year. And take your time to learn and to because your kids aren't going to do nothing during that time. But that doesn't, but parents don't want to hear that answer. I'm just saying, I feel that confident. Even if your kids are in high school, I would feel the same way. If they're younger, I definitely feel that way, the primary years. And so what I would say is, connect with people that you trust that are doing it, and give yourself a lot of grace and time, and slowly get into it. And there's no rush. And whatever you're doing at home, I can just feel so confident saying that if there is something constructive happening, it's going to be par or better than what's happening in schools a lot of times. And so I would say a few things that I would try to get people started with, and then I could really help people kind of create their own schools, or I don't want to call it school, but their own way of doing learning and living. And that's something I can help with. But I would start them with saying, get outside a lot, read a ton of good books, observe your children's interests, and learn as much as you want. Be a friend to the library, as long as your library is stocking it with good edifying books. Use the resources, like you said, in your family. So incorporate the use of uncles and aunts and grandparents, and get involved in community things based on kids' interests, sports, music, theater. It's endless what you can do. The flexibility is that as soon as you make the choice to home educate and take your kids from any kind of set schedule or school, you've just got better sleep, healthier meals, and a way more enriching way to live. Now, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, because I do understand that a lot of kids will, depending on how integrated they are in the schools, it's going to be challenging in those ways. And you have to have a pretty solid reason as parents. But I have no reluctance in saying it's a great way to do it. And so I acknowledge for sure that it's overwhelming at first. But if I could just, after all these years and talking with hundreds of homeschooling families, just let them know it works out. Like, you just got to stick with it.
Yeah. And I would say, don't invest in thousands of dollars worth of fancy curriculum that you may find after 4 weeks is not scratching where the kids itch.
Yeah.
You should tiptoe in rather than jump in the deep end, or don't go with everything that your friend is doing because she's so gung-ho about a certain brand of books. That's something that you will find you develop opinions on pretty quickly.
That's a really good point.
And also, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's a great point, because when people just jump into a curriculum, you feel tied to it, and you might stick to it just because you spent money on it or something. But the reality is, when you look at the statistics and you look at the research, here's one or two findings that I found very compelling in my research and my dissertation at the University of Alberta. And one was children who have a consistent chore, and then who perform that chore around the house effectively and do it well, has had more implications on successful university academic life than many other indicators. So that was crazy to me. Another one is that test taking is not a great indicator of good test taking in the university level. So for example, my first 3 kids have graduated without a diploma, and they've all gotten into university and they've all performed well, not because they were great test takers, but because they've learned to love learning, and they're not afraid to learn how to learn. And so, yeah, they might have been behind a little bit as far as how do strategies or something, but then they can learn that quickly. Like, it's not. And so I say those because we think we have to jump into these things. And one thing I do with families is I help them kind of identify because there's lots of types of homeschooling out there and learning. For example, eclectic or Charlotte Mason style or unschooling or classic education. And what I've learned from families is that they pick and pull from all of those, and they just become the Leah Farish homeschool family, or in my case, the Sarah Eaton. My wife drives that, and the kids' interests drive that, and that's what really where the learning comes from, more than a particular curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And great books.
Yeah, you mean literally the great books series, or do you mean
as well?
Little
But no,
G
I mean
great
just
books?
non-twaddle, like just great literature, and again, that's up to the family to decide what that is. But there's so much good out there.
And I've been amazed at how many books that I start to pay $27 for, and I look online and I can find a PDF of it. And many classic or old books like Puritan devotionals or whatever that maybe there's not a huge market for in hardback. You can find so much online, and so many even instructional things that are not twaddle, but are really things that I would not be able to teach, like Khan Academy and PragerU and things like that are just, they have the visuals with them, and they're free, and lots to commend them.
Yes. Well, and I think with the onset of AI and what that offers, it can be used again as a very effective tool, and it can also be destructive, just like any of these tools. But there are so many, and again, the library is not it isn't yet archaic. I mean, it has homeschool families are using libraries like crazy still, and so it's awesome.
Well, one last thing I want to hit that interested me. You mentioned the health and the healthy meals involved in being at home. I love that point. And I have, just in my contact with homeschoolers over the years, including being at some conventions or some gatherings where there are hundreds of homeschoolers, I just notice I rarely see an overweight homeschooler. And I wonder if there have been any studies on obesity among that student population, or other health factors among homeschool students. Are you aware of anything about that?
I'm not. That's a good question. That's a good question. I haven't tapped into that. That's a good question. But yeah, but I do agree that there is for some reason these families that typically, and that's been something I've tried to put my finger on, and it's been hard to see what is it, because these families are so different and they come from all different backgrounds. It used to be that you were either one of two camps, an ideologue or a pedagogue. And now homeschoolers come from every type of situation that you can't really categorize them anymore. But I have learned that, like you said, that there is this emphasis on natural health, and I think it might just be this idea of an openness to learn, and a desire for freedom and flexibility and asking questions. One thing I would share is that when I was doing my defense of my dissertation at the University of Alberta, I had 7 examiners, which is not normal. It's usually 6 with one external examiner. And the very first question that one of them said, he said, okay, before we start this, I just have to ask this question. And I said, well, go ahead. And he said, why do so many homeschoolers want to live on an acreage? And I just thought that was so funny because I had not known that, but it was true to my case. We've always wanted to live on acreages since we started homeschooling and have. And I think
Yeah.
it's because we love, as homeschool families, it's kind of a similar strand. It's because you value health and nature and you're asking questions and you want your kids to experience some chickens and some, some life or wildlife. And anyway, there's just like similar strands that connect all these families. Not that it's totally universal, but that there's some like-mindedness, like you said earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Montessori at the late elementary, middle school level recommends that the children be spending a significant amount of time cultivating gardens and caring for animals at that stage.
Yeah.
And you can pay $9,000 a year to have your kid go off and do that, or you can have them be gardening at your house.
Amen. Yeah. No, that's a great point.
Thank you so much for your insights and for what you're doing for your family and for culture in general, Tim. We're honored to have you. Where can people find you if they want to find your course or talk with you more?
I think the best place for people to do is even in like one thing is just to contact me at hello@thisgoldenhour.org. You can also go to thisgoldenhour.org and then that'll take you to different places to see everything I've got going. And obviously one of the best things to do is to, tap into the podcast, This Golden Hour.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll be sure and do that. Those of us who want to pursue this or recommend it. There is probably someone in your life who is thinking about homeschooling. So Tim is a great resource. Off you go. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LeahFarish.